So as you might have heard, Tammy Faye has had to prematurely close its run in the West End. It's actually really sad. It's been doing a little run at the Almeida. It's not got a transfer lined up, or at least not publicly that I've seen. And it's a really magical show, and we'll get onto more of that in a moment, but just the circumstances around it closing sucks so much. So I got really lucky, right? I queued up for day seats, like returns queue, on the 30th of November. I believe there were one, maybe two performances after the 30th, and then the final day, the Saturday, 3rd of December, which had a matinee and a final performance, were both cancelled. And it was due to illness in the cast, and it's so unfortunate because they got so close to the finish line, and they really deserved to be able to give the show the send-off that it deserved. But instead, a little bit of a premature ending, and I think, I could be wrong about this, but I think Katie Braben, who plays Tammy in the show, she's absolutely the lead of the whole thing. I think she might have gotten ill, I don't know. So maybe she got ill and they brought cover in for her, and then there was someone else that was ill in the cast maybe, and they just didn't have the depth of cast to fill the gap. I don't know. But what I do know is that the night that I saw it on the 30th of December was one of the final nights that they did. And it may have been Katie's final night playing Tammy. And what's insane about this is that on top of the fact that I queued and got return tickets and was just really happy to have managed to do that, because there were like 20 people in the returns queue or something, and I was really worried that I wouldn't get in. I walk in from the lobby to find my seat, I sit down, I'm getting comfy, and the guy next to me is like, "Oh yeah, Elton's here." I was like, huh? Huh? So my brain's thinking he's just talking about the fact that Elton wrote the music for this show. Lyrics are by Jake Shears, the book's by James Graham, but Elton did the music. But no, I turn and sort of follow his gaze across the room, and who do I see? 2 rows in front of me, just to my left? ELTON JOHN sitting down. He's got a little entourage around him, but he's smiling, he's happy, he's looking like he's about to have a good time. And this is seconds before the show starts, and that was obviously very tactical. They didn't want the guy getting swarmed. So the show kicks off, and we'll get more onto that in a sec, like I said. But I occasionally just sort of glance to the left a little bit, just to check in on ELTON JOHN. You know, we're buddies, we went to the theatre together. And through the entire thing, this guy is having a blast. He's bobbing his head. He's sort of grooving with the beat the entire time. He's really getting into it. And I even heard from someone that was sitting a little closer to him that occasionally he was singing along to the show, which I think in any other circumstance, I would be so annoyed by. But when it's the guy that wrote the music and that guy is Elton, I think he gets a pass. I mean, it's just so sweet. So just before the interval, he hurries out. Obviously, he's, again, trying to not get swarmed, and that's what his sort of security entourage are making sure of. And then I sit back down, and then second half, same deal, bobbing his head and stuff, rushes out right at the end, and I'm like, oh man, that's really unfortunate that he's not been able to fully enjoy the bows of the show and the closing moments, the sort of end of that final number. But boy, was I wrong, because what was actually happening is he was going round the back so that he could get on stage. So ELTON JOHN hobbles onto stage. He's not the most mobile person in the world at this point, which is understandable, but they bring him on and they do a bow with him, and it was just this really joyful moment. I've got a couple videos of it all. I'll have some of those on screen now, and I'll chuck some of those at the end as well, just for sort of extra Elton content. But it was really lovely. The fact that that was potentially Katie's final night doing the show, and then he was there, it felt a lot more special. Now, I think that Tammy really deserves a transfer and just really deserves more praise, more love, more dates. Give it just a longer run, extend the damn thing, do something. And I kind of think that it will happen, but also in preparing for this video, I looked on Wikipedia. There's been a whole bunch of Tammy Faye productions. I had no idea, but this is absolutely not new ground. And so I'm a little worried that it's going to kind of be seen as just another Tammy Faye musical or just another Tammy Faye production of some kind. And it's just not. It was so joyous and so heartfelt. And Katie Braben's performance, oh my God, it was so good. But before I dig into like specific characters, let's just give you a little context about what it's about overall. So Tammy is a televangelist in the 1970s. And she basically has this electric church, which is a Christian-focused TV channel, which gets really popular and then ends up spawning things like a Christian theme park and just all this crazy stuff. And she does that in partnership with her husband, Jim, who then ends up later being accused of rape and fraud and was then subsequently sentenced to jail. And so obviously, as you can imagine, in a story such as this, the empire comes crumbling down, and it's about coming to accept that and find peace with it. And the story in this production is framed, it's all within the frame of Tammy's memories when you find out in the opening moments of the show that she actually needs to be operated on. Now, before I go any further, I want to quickly say, I'm going to talk about spoilers here. Like, this is sort of no holds barred. So if you haven't seen it yet and it comes back, highly recommend, seriously. But if you're here for the tea, then let's go. So Tammy finds out she has cancer, and the entire frame is her kind of reliving her memories because one of the doctors that works in the hospital or whatever that she's in actually says to her that she was a really important part of her childhood and her household growing up. And Tammy's like, oh wow, it's sort of amazing that I was able to contribute to your life in that way. And then it's kind of insinuated that it's her life flashing before her eyes as she dies, and that's what the show's framed around. So Katie Braben, already said it, gonna say it again. Phenomenal. She did one or two things that I was uncertain about, but we'll get onto that. But 99% of her performance was, in my opinion, just perfect. She's transformed herself for this role in such an incredible way. And you look at like a cast photo of her in rehearsals or something, it's a different person. It's really remarkable. She's supported by Andrew Rannells, and Andrew Rannells is someone that I have a huge amount of respect for. I love his performances in everything I've ever seen him in, and just in general. I actually met the guy afterwards very briefly at Stage Door, and he was in a rush because they were all going off to presumably party with Elton John, to some extent at least. Don't know if you really count it as partying when the guy's like 105 years old. But still, he was really busy, still took the time out of his day to stop, say hello, take a picture with people that were there. Like, he was just being really wholesome, genuine guy. And his performance was interesting because I think that he did everything right, but he was less present in the show than I expected. Don't get me wrong, he's there 24/7, but I just sort of had it in my head that because it was Andrew Rannells, he might be more of the focus, when really he's supporting Tammy the entire way. This isn't a criticism, it's just an observation of something that I didn't realize going into the show. So Rannells is sort of there, which is wonderful because he's great. And the chemistry between the two of them is so fantastic. The book is incredibly well written for this, I think. Like I mean, this is very different, but I saw The Band's Visit in very quick succession with Tammy Faye. And by comparison, The Band's Visit looked like a GCSE performance. I loved it. Don't get me wrong. I really enjoyed that show. I don't want to sound like I'm talking down on it too much, but the book in Tammy is so well written. It is perfect. It's full of these witty little lines, these jokes that land every single time, jokes that some of the audience actually missed because they were too highbrow or too kind of maybe crass almost in some moments, but that meant that the people that got it were in hysterics, and then people would twig a second later and then they'd start cracking up. It was very, very funny. And I don't think there was a single joke where I was like, that was kind of delivered poorly, or that didn't really land. And for musical theatre, I think that's actually quite unique. I think that almost always when a writer's trying to be witty in that way, there's always something that lands a bit flat. They're always trying to throw in one little gag over there and one little gag over here, and they just don't quite get it. Let me think if I can remember a good example. Okay, so again, very different kind of show, but in 101 Dalmatians at the Regent's Park Open Air earlier this year, there's a whole bunch of jokes in that about Cruella being an influencer, but it just sort of uses the wrong words at certain times to describe what she's doing or what she's sort of scheming about and things. And so like the structure of the joke made sense, but the fact that someone that clearly is not part of that culture wrote the joke meant that it just didn't land. Like, right intention, but very slightly wrong execution, which meant that the rug kind of got pulled from under it. Whereas in Tammy, they get it. And it works. And it's just phenomenal. I also have to say, the start of Act 1, oh my goodness, the gospel vibe that Elton brings to that is so fantastic. Especially, I'd say the first maybe 20 minutes of the show where it's just layered on. It's so good. And it makes me want a freaking cast album so bad. Give us the soundtrack, please, for the love of God, because the music is so wonderful. And I've got little snippets of it that they've posted on social, for example, that I'm like, oh yeah, that sounds really good, but I don't have the rest. So it's just this little island of he's inside women and he's inside men, he's inside Tammy and he's inside Jim. Like, it's good, but I need more in my home now. I also really liked the staging. So they've got this construction at the back of basically TV screens, and it's just a stack of them, and various screens have a sheet that they can pull down and have a person appear behind. And because you've got various other televangelists in the show, and you've also got politicians, you've got the Pope at one point. Oh my God. You've got one scene, or a couple actually, where the Archbishop of Canterbury, I think, is talking to the Pope, who's talking to Jim or someone else. And their dialogues with one another are so uproariously funny. And it's enabled by this very simple set design of just stack of TVs, but it works really well. They also use the balconies a tiny bit at the back of the upper area of the stage. Personally, I didn't like that so much, purely because in the stalls in the Almeida, you've got quite a low-hanging ceiling and it's quite far forward. And so you often can't see those balcony areas that well in my experience. But I spoke to some other people in the crowd and they could see totally fine from where they were. So maybe I just got really unlucky with my seat. I was fairly far back, in fairness. I think I was row H, maybe? I basically didn't realize they were using the balconies. And then in Act 2, I was like, oh, there they are. Speaking of Act 2, the ensemble numbers come back in Act 2. There's kind of a bit of a pause on them towards the end of Act 1, which I think makes sense because it's no longer about this big gospel celebration, and it's more certain characters need certain songs to progress their plot and tell you about them. But when they come back in Act 2, oh, it's just so much fun. And they had this one song where they started it off with a stomp, which was so powerful. I mean, this sounds really basic, but they're just stomping, 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 stomping. And then it gives you this almost like war drum kind of feeling with this rhythm that's just driving through the whole song. And because they're all doing it so cleanly and such a synchronized manner, it just elevates the song. And I think in that particular point in the show as well, all the lighting goes red. And so you've kind of got this feeling of like, she's really coming to the end of her story here, the end of her flashback and the end of her life too. And this thematic kind of vibe is surrounding this end of this plot because that's what the frame is doing. So I really appreciated that, even if that wasn't really the intention in that moment. And there were a few other things they did with just props that they had too, which I thought were brilliant. So, for example, a lot of the show features handheld mics instead of your normal sort of theater mic. The reason for that being that they're on TV with a mic. Like in the studio, they would have had a mic. So they're singing into the mic. And sometimes they're grabbing a mic from another person and being like, well, it's my line now. And then someone else grabs the mic. It's my line now. And I thought that was really nice. It's a small thing. It's a small choice that ends up having big implications, I think, for how the show feels. So big thumbs up from me on that front. But what it did mean, and this is what I wanted to say earlier about Katie Braben's performance, is that sometimes when she was belting, she wasn't belting. It was weird. It would look like she was belting. It would look like she was giving it her all, but her voice would be a little quiet. And I know that obviously belting is not a facial expression, like it's something else entirely, but it was just a little bit, I think, dissonant, just slightly, not her singing, not melodically, but just in terms of what the viewer was understanding about the scene or receiving from the performance versus what she was giving it. It felt in those moments like Tammy, as a character, was really trying to give it her all and really let go. But then behind that, you had Katie, who sort of looked like she might have had a bit more in the tank, but she was holding it back within herself a little bit. Like she wasn't fully letting it all out, but instead it was this somewhat, I don't want to say muted because that's the wrong word, but it was a withdrawn belt instead of a fully outward one. Again, I don't think this was a technique problem. Like, I don't think this was a bad thing. It just was unusual because in those moments I was like, oh, I'm expecting this to be the moment where Tammy kind of claims the space as her own and she's really making you understand that the spotlight is on her and her only here. But instead she would sort of do these belts and it would be into these mics, and instead she would do these sort of dramatic notes into these mics as well, and it would just sort of feel like maybe she could have been turned up in the sound system or something. I don't know. I'm not sure exactly what it was. Could also have been partly related to where I was sitting. I guess the sound was kind of struggling to get in there a little bit compared to maybe elsewhere in the theater. It was just something I noticed. I also think that just in terms of this show's success, how much commercial success it's going to have, if that's the right word, I think its biggest shortfall, its biggest weakness, is that it actually doesn't really have enough bangers. And I want to be careful how you interpret this, the viewer of my video, because I'm absolutely not saying that any of the music is bad or any of it doesn't slap. Like, it's good. And some of it is really damn good. But if I was looking back on the show and thinking, are there any songs in here that people are going to use as like audition material? There's not that much. Like there's one called If You Came to See Me Cry, which is Tammy pretty much pushing back on all of the people that doubt her in that moment and saying, I'm a strong woman and I'm going to fight through this kind of vibe. And it's a powerful song. And it's great as well because Tammy was known for turning on the waterworks and just crying. Like in real life, the real Tammy Faye would do that all the time on air. And in this song, she's saying, well, actually, my more authentic self is that I'm not going to be just crying here and giving you what you want, showing you that I'm weak. I'm actually going to be strong and surpass your expectations. So like the song is great in terms of the theming within the musical. The song is really great to listen to and it's a strong song in the show, but I can't remember how it goes. And that goes for pretty much the entire musical here. I didn't walk out with any song from it in my head. And I'm the kind of person that like I wake up with a new song in my head every single day and it's often a random musical theater song. But since seeing it, not once has it been something from Tammy Faye because I just haven't been able to get any of those melodies in my head. Like they're not catchy in that way. And I don't think that that's a crime. Like I don't think that every musical needs to have some pop banger that's written to just be an earworm. And if you don't have one, then you've failed. But I think that in terms of its commercial success and in the potential for it to expand to as wide an audience as possible, if you don't have those kind of almost tentpole songs, then you are going to struggle a little with your virality. Like I'm thinking of like a Michael in the bathroom or a waving through a window or just like something. I mean, again, I'm not saying that it needs songs like that because it's not that kind of musical, but I just think that a song, like one singular song that was written a little bit more to be a modern pop song as opposed to an Elton pop song might have contributed to it spreading a little bit more and potentially having better reach in the future. But the fact that it doesn't have that doesn't knock any points off for me. This show was a 10 out of 10. The experience was a 10 out of 10. I had a wonderful time and everyone in the cast was a joy to watch and justified an extension or a transfer or whatever 10 times over in my mind before Act 1 had even finished. Like I had a really wonderful time watching Tammy Faye and I hope and cross my fingers and my other fingers and all my toes, oh God, that we get to see it again at some point on the West End because it was just a pure pleasure and it made me cry and it was the exact kind of crying that I was looking for from that show and I was just so heartwarming at the end and fantastic. So it's a 10 out of 10. Please come back soon, but for now, goodbye Tammy Faye.
Our final week of performances here at Tammy Faye, and we are so honored to get to tell this story every night, and we are especially honored this evening to have with us our incredible book writer, James Graham, our amazing lyricist, Jake Shears, and the one and only Sir ELTON JOHN.